July 14, 1941, outside Orsha, Belarus. Obergefreiter Klaus Steiner crouched in a roadside ditch, cleaning his rifle while his company rested during their advance into Soviet territory. 3 weeks into Operation Barbarossa, and German forces seemed unstoppable. The Red Army was collapsing, fleeing, or surrendering by the tens of thousands. Then came a sound Steiner would never forget, a screeching wail like thousands of banshees, growing louder by the second. He looked up to see the sky itself seem to ignite. Streaks of fire arced overhead, hundreds of them, their trails leaving smoke patterns against the blue morning sky. The sound was demonic, a howling, screaming roar that made men drop their weapons and cover their ears. The first salvo hit 200 meters ahead. The second hit 150 meters. The third landed directly on his company's position. What happened next defied comprehension. The entire world became fire and explosions. Not the crack of artillery shells landing one after another, but a continuous rolling thunder, one endless detonation that shook the earth like an earthquake. Trees disintegrated. Vehicles flipped end over end. Men simply vanished, one moment standing, the next replaced by smoke and debris. Steiner pressed himself flat into the ditch, hands over his head, screaming prayers no one could hear over the apocalyptic roar. Shrapnel tore through the air above him. The concussion felt like being punched repeatedly in the chest by an invisible giant. 8 seconds. That's how long it lasted. 8 seconds of continuous mechanical hell. When silence finally returned, Steiner raised his head. His entire company, 180 men, had ceased to exist as a fighting force. 67 were dead. 89 were wounded. The rest were catatonic, staring blankly, unable to respond to commands. The battalion commander rode up on horseback, surveyed the devastation, and asked what had happened. "Stalin's organ pipes," someone whispered. "The Katyusha." The BM-13 Katyusha rocket launcher, nicknamed Stalin's organ by Germans who heard its distinctive wail, was born from Soviet desperation and revolutionary thinking. In 1938, Soviet engineers faced a problem. The Red Army's artillery doctrine required massive firepower delivered rapidly, but conventional guns couldn't fire fast enough. A 152mm howitzer might fire 3-4 rounds per minute. Soviet doctrine called for hundreds of shells simultaneously. The solution was radical: abandon artillery entirely and use rockets. Rockets offered unprecedented advantages. No recoil meant lightweight launchers. No barrel wear meant unlimited fire rate. Multiple rockets could be mounted on simple rails. And mass production was cheap. A rocket cost 1/10 of an equivalent artillery shell. The BM-13 system mounted 16 M13 rockets on a modified ZIS-6 truck. Each rocket was 6 feet long, weighed 92 pounds, and carried 9.3 pounds of high explosive. But the rocket's true weapon wasn't the explosive. It was the psychological effect. The M13 rocket used solid fuel that burned unevenly, causing the rocket to wobble in flight. This wobble created a distinctive howling shriek that could be heard for miles. The sound wasn't accidental. Soviet designers deliberately enhanced it, knowing terror was as valuable as explosives. A single BM-13 launcher could fire all 16 rockets in 7 to 10 seconds, saturating a 4-acre area with explosives and shrapnel. A battery of 4 launchers, 64 rockets total, could obliterate everything in a zone the size of 4 football fields in less than 10 seconds. And unlike artillery, Katyushas fired from concealed positions, struck without warning, then vanished before counter-battery fire could respond. The Katyusha's combat debut came on July 14, 1941, near Orsha, the exact engagement that nearly killed Klaus Steiner. Captain Ivan Flerov commanded an experimental battery, 7 BM-13 launchers mounted on trucks with 112 rockets total. Soviet High Command had authorized field testing but provided minimal guidance. Flerov was essentially inventing rocket artillery tactics in real time. German forces had captured Orsha railway station, a critical logistics hub, and were using it to stockpile ammunition and fuel for their advance. Hundreds of Wehrmacht soldiers occupied the station and surrounding buildings. Flerov positioned his battery 3 kilometers away behind a forested ridge. At 15:15 hours, he gave the order to fire. 112 rockets launched in 15 seconds. The sound was unlike anything heard in warfare before, a screeching, howling roar that echoed across the countryside. German soldiers at the station looked up in confusion, then terror, as the sky filled with smoke trails converging on their position. The rockets impacted in a rolling barrage that lasted 12 seconds. The entire station complex vanished behind smoke and flame. Ammunition dumps detonated in secondary explosions. Fuel trucks exploded, spreading burning gasoline across the area. Buildings collapsed. When the smoke cleared, Orsha station was gone. German casualties exceeded 200 killed. Survivors described a hurricane of fire that struck from nowhere with no warning. But Flerov knew his position was compromised. Within minutes of firing, he ordered the battery to relocate. German counter-battery fire landed on empty forest 7 minutes later. This pattern, devastating surprise strike, immediate withdrawal, defined Katyusha tactics throughout the war. Katyushas didn't just kill, they destroyed minds. German soldiers who survived rocket attacks reported psychological symptoms unlike those from conventional artillery. The distinctive screaming sound became a trauma trigger. Veterans would panic at similar noises, factory whistles, train brakes, even wind through trees. Wehrmacht psychiatrist Dr. Heinrich Schmidt, treating frontline troops in 1942, documented Katyusha syndrome, acute anxiety reaction specific to rocket artillery. Patients describe overwhelming dread at the sound of Katyusha rockets. Unlike conventional shells, which announce themselves with a whistle, the Katyusha's scream continues throughout its flight, building from distant wail to deafening shriek. The soldier has 5 to 7 seconds knowing death is coming, but unable to take effective shelter. The saturation effect compounds the terror. Artillery shells land sequentially. One can track the barrage and predict relative safety. Katyushas land simultaneously across the entire target area. There is nowhere to hide, nowhere safe. This sense of helplessness produces panic even in veteran troops. Captured German officers consistently rated Katyusha strikes as more psychologically damaging than tank attacks or aerial bombardment. The combination of sound, surprise, and saturation created a unique form of battlefield terror. Soviet commanders recognized this and exploited it ruthlessly. Katyusha batteries were often positioned to maximize sound effects. Nighttime firing was preferred. The visual spectacle of hundreds of rocket trails enhanced the psychological impact. Pre-recorded Katyusha sounds were played through loudspeakers to trigger panic before actual attacks. What made Katyushas truly revolutionary was their production simplicity. The BM-13 launcher was crude, welded steel rails mounted on a truck chassis with a hand-cranked elevation mechanism. No precision machining, no complex optics, no advanced metallurgy. Factory workers with basic welding skills could assemble them. The M13 rockets were equally simple. Sheet metal bodies, solid fuel packed by hand, basic impact fuses. No precision required, no complex components. Soviet factories produced Katyushas at staggering rates. 1941, 1,300 launchers produced despite evacuation of factories ahead of German advance. 1942, 3,237 launchers. Production tripled as evacuated factories resumed operation in Ural Mountains. 1943, 5,500 launchers. Peak production as Soviet industry fully mobilized. 1944, 1945, 10,800 launchers, including heavy 300mm variants. Total wartime production exceeded 21,000 launchers and 12 million rockets. This dwarfed German production of comparable weapons. Germany's Nebelwerfer rocket launcher saw only 5,500 units produced during the entire war. Soviet industrial philosophy prioritized quantity over quality. A Katyusha launcher might be crude and imprecise, but when 48 launchers fired simultaneously, 768 rockets landing within 45 seconds, precision became irrelevant. Factory worker Anna Dmitrievna, who assembled Katyushas in Sverdlovsk from 1942–1945, later recalled, "We worked 18-hour shifts, 7 days a week. Most workers were women, the men were at the front. We knew our rockets were killing fascists, saving Soviet soldiers. That knowledge made the exhaustion bearable. Every launcher we completed meant dozens of German deaths. We built them faster than Germany could replace the soldiers our rockets killed." The Battle of Stalingrad saw Katyushas reach peak effectiveness. Soviet forces defending the city deployed over 100 Katyusha batteries, 1,600 PLA launchers, creating the densest concentration of rocket artillery in history. German forces attacking through the city's rubble found themselves in a nightmare. Katyushas could fire indirectly over buildings, saturating German-held blocks without direct line of sight. The rocket's blast effects were amplified by urban terrain. Explosions reflected off concrete and steel, creating devastating overpressure that killed soldiers hiding in buildings. German 6th Army Commander General Friedrich Paulus wrote in October 1942, "Soviet rocket artillery makes movement by day impossible and concentration of forces suicidal. We lose more men to rocket strikes than to conventional artillery. The psychological effect on troops is severe. Many refuse to leave cover when Katyusha fire is reported nearby." Soviet tactics evolved specifically for Stalingrad's urban warfare. Forward observers in tall buildings called rocket strikes on German positions. Then Soviet infantry attacked while Germans were still stunned. The combination of rocket saturation followed by immediate assault gave Germans no time to recover. One engagement exemplified Katyusha effectiveness. On November 19, 1942, the opening of Operation Uranus, the Soviet counteroffensive, 320 Katyusha launchers fired simultaneously at German positions north of Stalingrad. 5,120 rockets landed in 90 seconds across a 6-kilometer front. The result? Complete destruction of 2 German infantry regiments, capture of 1,800 demoralized survivors, and collapse of the northern defensive line within hours. German soldiers emerging from the barrage were too shocked to fight. Many surrendered without resistance. Germany attempted to counter Katyushas through various means, all ultimately ineffective. Tactical counters proved useless. Dispersing troops reduced casualties but prevented massed attacks. Building strong fortifications was pointless. Katyushas simply saturated larger areas. Counter-battery fire failed because Katyushas relocated immediately after firing. Technical countermeasures were attempted. German forces developed sound-ranging equipment to locate Katyusha batteries, but the rocket's short flight time, under 10 seconds, meant batteries could fire and relocate before German artillery responded. Luftwaffe aircraft hunted Katyushas but struggled to locate mobile launchers hidden in forests or under camouflage. Psychological countermeasures failed completely. Wehrmacht commanders issued orders forbidding soldiers from calling Katyushas Stalin's organ. The nickname itself supposedly damaged morale. The order was universally ignored. Frontline troops continued using the term precisely because it captured their terror. Germany did develop its own rocket artillery, the Nebelwerfers series. But German rockets never matched Katyusha psychological impact. The Nebelwerfers' sound was less distinctive, its rate of fire slower, and German launchers were far less mobile. More critically, Germany lacked industrial capacity for mass production. While Soviet factories produced 21,000 Katyusha launchers, Germany built only 5,500 Nebelwerfers. The numerical disparity meant Soviet forces enjoyed overwhelming rocket artillery superiority throughout the war. The ultimate demonstration of Katyusha power came in June 1944 during Operation Bagration, the Soviet offensive that destroyed German Army Group Center. Soviet forces concentrated 400 Katyusha batteries, over 6,000 launchers, along a 600-kilometer front. The opening barrage on June 23, 1944, was the largest rocket artillery strike in human history. At 05 hours, 6,000 launchers fired simultaneously, 96,000 rockets launched within 2 minutes. The sound was audible 50 kilometers away, a continuous roar like an earthquake combined with a locomotive. German defensive positions across the entire front vanished under saturation fire. The barrage targeted communication centers, artillery positions, and headquarters, deliberately destroying German command and control before the main assault. Within 30 minutes, German Army Group Center lost communication with most forward units. German survivors described apocalyptic scenes. Major Hans von Luck, commanding a panzer battalion. The world became fire. Everything burned. Forests, buildings, vehicles, men. The sound was beyond description, not explosions, but one continuous thunderclap. My battalion lost 40% strength before we even saw Soviet infantry. Many men were not killed but incapacitated, bleeding from ears, unable to stand, mentally broken. Operation Bagration destroyed 28 German divisions in 5 weeks, over 400,000 casualties, worse than Stalingrad. Katyusha strikes were responsible for approximately 20 to 25% of German losses and, more importantly, created the psychological conditions that turned retreat into rout. Operating Katyushas required discipline and courage. The launchers were vulnerable, thin-skinned trucks with no armor carrying hundreds of pounds of explosives and solid rocket fuel. Guards Sergeant Yekaterina Mikhailova commanded a Katyusha battery from 1943-1945. Her 1982 memoir describes the crew experience. We lived with constant danger. One German shell hitting our trucks meant instant death. The rockets would detonate like a bomb. We positioned vehicles under trees, covered them with camouflage nets, and changed locations 3 times daily. Firing was coordinated chaos. 4 trucks, 16 rockets each. The commander would give coordinates, we'd adjust elevation and traverse, then wait for the signal. When it came, fire! All 64 rockets launched in seconds. The trucks would shake violently. The noise was indescribable. Flames shot backwards from the rockets. The smell of burning fuel filled the air. Then we'd drive away immediately, racing to new positions before German artillery could respond. We had 3 minutes maximum. Slower meant death. I lost half my battery at Kursk. A German dive bomber caught us during reload. 2 trucks exploded, killing 8 crew. The survivors loaded the remaining launchers and fired anyway, because that's what we did. We were instruments of revenge for every burned village, every murdered civilian, every war crime the fascists committed on Soviet soil. Katyushas didn't just destroy German forces, they destroyed German confidence. By 1944, Wehrmacht soldiers had developed a fatalistic acceptance of conventional artillery. Shells were random. You might live or die based purely on luck. But Katyushas were different. The sound announced certain death for someone in the target area, and the saturation meant hiding was futile. This psychological certainty broke veteran troops. Men who'd survived Stalingrad, who'd fought at Kursk, who'd endured years of Eastern Front combat, panicked at the Katyusha's scream. Unit cohesion disintegrated. Soldiers fled positions or surrendered rather than endure rocket strikes. German Corporal Friedrich Weber, captured in Belarus in July 1944, told Soviet interrogators, "We weren't afraid of your tanks or your infantry. But when we heard Stalin's organ, we knew death was coming. Not might be coming, was coming." Some men shot themselves rather than wait for the rockets. Others simply ran. There was no shame anymore, no discipline, just terror. This was Katyusha's ultimate victory. Not the Germans it killed, but the Germans it broke without killing. Soviet rocket artillery doctrine developed through Katyusha experience, influenced Cold War military thinking and remains relevant today. The core principle, mass saturation fire, achieving psychological and physical destruction simultaneously, became standard for Soviet military planning. Every Soviet motorized rifle division included a rocket artillery battalion. The BM-21 Grad system, introduced in 1963, was essentially an improved Katyusha, using the same tactical concepts. Modern multiple rocket launcher systems, American M270 MLRS, Russian BM-30, Smerch, Chinese PHL-03, all trace their ancestry to the Katyusha. The principle remains unchanged. Saturate large areas with hundreds of projectiles in seconds, creating psychological shock and physical destruction that conventional artillery cannot match. The sound legacy persists too. Modern rocket artillery is designed to be visually and acoustically terrifying. The psychological weapon that Soviet engineers accidentally discovered in 1938, distinctive sound creating fear disproportionate to actual lethality, remains a deliberate design feature in 21st century weapons. The Katyusha rocket launcher killed perhaps 200,000, 300,000 German soldiers during World War II. But its true impact was psychological. The millions more who heard it scream and felt their courage dissolve, who abandoned positions not from rational calculation, but from pure terror, who surrendered because facing Katyushas was worse than becoming prisoners. Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union expecting rapid victory against a backward nation with obsolete weapons. Instead, they encountered weapons like the Katyusha, crude, simple, but devastatingly effective precisely because they prioritized psychological destruction over technical elegance. Klaus Steiner, who survived that first Katyusha strike at Orsha, was captured at Königsberg in April 1945. Soviet interrogators asked what weapon he feared most during 4 years of Eastern Front combat. "Stalin's organ," he replied immediately. "I faced Soviet tanks, artillery, aircraft, everything, but nothing compared to the Katyusha. The sound alone could break you. When you heard it, you knew the world was about to end. Some men never recovered. They'd hear a similar sound and collapse, screaming." The Katyusha didn't just kill us, it made us understand we'd invaded hell itself, and hell had weapons we couldn't imagine. That was the Katyusha's legacy, not just a weapon, but a revelation. Soviet engineering had created something that combined industrial mass production with primal terror. 8 seconds of mechanical hell that could erase entire battalions and shatter the minds of survivors. The war ended 80 years ago, but the Katyusha's descendants still serve in armies worldwide. The doctrine it created, saturate, terrify, destroy, remains standard military practice. And somewhere, veterans on both sides still hear that distinctive scream in their nightmares, the sound that announced death was falling from the sky and there was nowhere left to hide.